What are the stories of impact and ingenuity that are transforming our cities? Join us on the Urban Q, where we talk about tackling urban conundrums and celebrate stories, ideas, and people that help us create better cities for all. Hello, and welcome to the Urban Q. Today I have with me Professor Edward Glaeser. Edward Glaeser is one of the world's leading voices on cities and economic growth. As the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics at Harvard, he's been at the forefront of urban economics and economic theory since 1992. He leads the Urban Economics Working Group at the National Bureau of Economic Research and co-directs the Cities program at the International Growth Center. Glaeser has written extensively on cities and urban inequality, including several influential books, Triumph of the City, Survival of the City, and Fighting Poverty in the US and Europe. He has previously served as chair of Harvard's Economics Department, director of the Taubman Center and Rappaport Institute, and is currently co-editor of the Journal of Urban Economics. His work has earned him top honors, including the Albert O. Hirschman Prize and fellowships with the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Welcome, Ed, and thank you for joining us on our podcast, The Urban Q.
Thank you so much for having me on.
All right, so we're going to jump right in, Ed, with the first question that I ask most of my guests about their favorite cities. Now, you've written passionately about the magic of cities, about how they bring people together and encourage innovation. So what is your most memorable or cherished experience that made you fall in love with cities? Was it a particular street or a neighborhood or a city that sparked it? Can you share with us?
So I grew up in New York City during the 1970s, and I think I fell in love not with a particular place, but with the dynamism that New York had, both in those years and in the years afterwards. This early 1970s was a period in which New York was really falling apart. I mean, the economic dynamo of the city, the garment industry had collapsed, hundreds of thousands of jobs lost over a short number of years. Crime had risen spectacularly. The city couldn't pay its bills, and yet somehow or other it soldiered on. And yet somehow or other magical things kept on happening as people learned from one another, worked with one another, had fun, and made a living. And so New York is really my starting place for why I fell in love with cities and trying to understand them, both the good and the bad.
That's wonderful. I know that New York is a favorite city of many people, me included, so no surprise there. Now, and you've studied American cities very closely and have said that cities make us richer, smarter, and sometimes more unequal. So when you visit or think about cities where this contrast is stark, or the informality is deeply woven into the urban fabric, especially in developing countries like India, what goes through your mind or surprises you? And how do you think can we enable upward mobility for everyone who lives in cities?
So I think one of the biggest issues going forward in terms of developing world cities is the extent to which they can be engines of opportunity for the poor residents. No one should be surprised by urban inequality or even necessarily bothered by it. Cities attract rich people because they're really fun places to be rich, and they attract poor people because they offer the possibility of change. But that inequality is only tolerable if cities are performing their historic mandate, this historic job to turn poor children into middle income or wealthy adults. In my own work in Brazil, we found that poor people who are poor in their early 20s do in fact do quite well in cities of the South in Brazil, but not in the cities of the North. And we think the difference, at least in a statistical sense, can be explained by the relative economic integration of less skilled workers in southern cities than in northern cities in Brazil. So northern cities tend to focus on more extractive industries, focused on natural resources. The southern Brazilian cities are much more prone to engage in sort of normal, integrated, complex industries. And that feels really important to me, that in fact, the magic of cities only works through interaction. It works through people finding people who are different than them, who know things that they don't, and working together. If the cities are organized in a way that basically separates the rich and the poor, then the poor will not benefit from cities. The critical element is the integration. And I think for adults, that's even more important in the workplace than it is in the neighborhood.
Now, that's very interesting, and the comparison that you had from Brazil and the northern, the southern cities. Now, and you also said that you know how cities are designed. So, how do you think can urban design and economic policy basically help achieve this inclusive, sort of better balanced growth, especially in rapidly urbanizing regions across the world?
I think it's hard for public policy to necessarily mandate integration at the neighborhood level. It tends to be hard. I think by and large, there are issues with Indian cities that almost assuredly makes the matter worse. And I think that's probably true both at the firm level and at the neighborhood level. And I think one of the ways, at least that I understand this, is that if you have a legal sector, whether or not it's housing or firms, that is highly regulated and must be sort of relatively pristine or must be very low density or must be follow a set of rules. And then you have a largely unregulated sector, which is, able to get by that, be it, in Dharavi or be it in firms that are not following any rules, then you're going to have a separation where poorer Indians end up working or living in the deregulated sector, in the deregulated, unregulated sector, and highly skilled Indians end up working in the skilled sector and living in formal housing. That feels like a problem to me. And I think the answer is to try to make it easier for unregulated firms to become regulated, to promote housing that actually will be usable by middle or lower income Indians, that is legal. And sort of working to, in some sense, heal the artificial separation that exists between the formal and informal sectors and between formal and informal housing.
That's very interesting. Heal the separation, the artificial separation that exists. And that speaks to a human or a people-centered component. And we talk a lot about density and agglomeration in urban theory, but there is a crucial human component. You've also said that cities magnify humanity's strengths. They bring people together, enabling them to do things that they couldn't do otherwise, and stimulating the cross-fertilization of ideas and skills. But in the post-pandemic world, where a lot of the hybrid work and virtual collaboration is on the rise, how do you see the role of proximity evolving, especially in the global South cities, and how do you see this artificial divide starting to heal?
I don't see a world in which we're all going to, devolve to this technology to Zoom and cease to connect with one another. I think that it's bad for everyone. It's particularly bad, as you say, for the least fortunate, for the least well-educated. I mean, I'm struck by the fact that in May 2020, 59% of Americans with graduate degrees were working remotely. 5% of America's high school dropouts were working remotely, right? There's a huge educational divide in terms of using these technologies. That being said, the health risks are real. I mean, there are demons that come with density,
Right.
crime, traffic congestion, high housing costs, and above all, contagious disease. And, infection has been a companion for urban life for thousands of years. The necessary way to fight this, the necessary way to make sure that we're not afraid of being around other human beings, is having a really robust public health strategy. I think above all, that starts with clean water and then sewage. But other things as well. And I was really struck by the remarkable serological work of Anoop Milani, who went in the summer of 2020 and measured the prevalence of COVID in different parts of Mumbai. He found that more than 50% of the dwellers in Mumbai slums had already gotten COVID by July 2020, whereas about 11 or 12% of the richer Mumbai residents had done so. So I think the really key thing is to continue to invest in public health, to see all of India as being needing of protection, needing of help, to continue working on the medicines that involve vaccines and other forms of preventive health, and taking this seriously. But I think the right answer is not turning against face-to-face interactions. Those interactions are the lifeblood, indeed, of creativity as well as of productivity.
No, and that's important because when we're talking about these kind of local issues, when you're talking about health, water, sewage, and all of that management, these are local issues which need local sort of governance. And you've made a strong case for empowering local governments. However, sometimes that does not play out. We've seen that though we have a constitutional amendment that enables it, but it doesn't often play out in cities that way. So, what lessons can countries with sort of more centralized governance structures take from that idea, especially in sort of managing their urban transformations?
I think the issue of enabling there to be enough local capacity to handle local problems is really huge. Ideally, it would be financed with local property taxes. Local property taxes are relatively good for this purpose because buildings don't run away, and because the value of buildings embeds the quality of life in the urban area. And so they're tied together. When I look at the history of cities in the West, a great deal of good happened at the local level. So in our book Survival of the City, we basically tell the story of how in Western cities we started to invest in sewers and clean water in the 19th century. This happened largely at the local level, right? This wasn't about national government. And in a sense, if you think about for most of the past 1,000 years, Western governments have been overwhelmingly in the business of just taking people's lives, right? They've been in the warfare business. In the 19th century, that switched. And suddenly there were governments that started to save lives rather than to take lives. And that happened with local governments that responded to the needs of local residents and tried to save people's lives. Of course, in colonial empires, and in some sense, the modern Indian government is still has a legacy of that, right? A failure to cater to local needs led to a public health disaster, and certainly the story of 19th and mid 20th century India is one of public health disaster after public health disaster because the British Empire inflicted connection to the outside world on India and inflicted disease like the influenza pandemic that came back in 1919 without doing the critical investments that were needed in public health to keep Indian urbanites safe. I think the task right now is to make sure that the Indian government doesn't repeat the errors of empire and to make sure that localities have the power that they need to invest in clean health and to invest in the sort of infrastructure that will enable them to thrive and flourish in the 21st century.
That's very interesting. And your take on, just creating healthy cities, healthy neighborhoods, and, investing in health infrastructure and an infrastructure which leads to sort of better quality of life and health. Housing is among them, right? So, and housing is also one of the most visible signs of exclusion in cities sometimes. So, in your view, what's the smartest path forward to making urban housing more affordable without stifling growth or pushing people to the peripheries, which is what typically happens as urban settlements start to get more and more dense and cost prohibitive?
So I think there are really two things, one of which I've spoken about for many years, and I learned about this from the great Alain Berthaud, who's a wonderful expert on urban planning, is just reduce regulation, reduce the floor area requirements, make it easier to add density in places like Mumbai, and just get out of the way of building. And I think that's the first recipe is just to make it easier for the private sector to act. The second thing is to ask, why isn't productivity in construction going up more quickly? I've just recently completed a paper which is on U.S. construction productivity, which shows that for most of the 20th century, right, there's an arc of construction productivity. It's relatively flat from 1900 to 1940. It soars from 1940 to 1970, and then it goes backwards from 1970 to 2020. Our story is that what regulation did is it shrunk the size of projects. As the project got smaller, the companies got smaller, and small, tiny companies who are unlike those in any other industry do not invest in R&D. They do not innovate. We really need to have a world in which there's lots of innovation in the construction sector, particularly in the developing world, particularly in India. I think mass-produced housing has a lot to say for it. Figuring out how to get the magic of factories going in terms of providing easy to use, pleasant, safe housing. I'd like to see a lot of that going forward.
So when we talk about that and mass-produced housing and prefab housing and those kind of things, there's a climate angle to all of this, and there's a resilience angle to all of this, and what all of this infrastructure is able to withstand. Cities now are both sort of contributors to and victims of climate change. So, what role do you see for economic incentives and market-based solutions in driving the urban climate action that is so desperately needed in cities? And is there an example that stands out to you?
Well, it's like many economists, I see very few natural substitutes for a carbon tax. Whether or not that will happen or not, I don't know. But certainly the most natural thing is if you think the carbon emissions are causing grave harm to the planet, we should charge people who create those carbon emissions. Any alternative is going to be very second best to that. And in terms of actual policies, but there it is. Second point I would make. I think it's quite right for America to worry a lot about so-called mitigation, which is reducing the carbon emissions that we have created, which caused harm to the world. Same thing is true for Europe. I am just not very worried about poorer world countries investing in mitigation. Like, we created this mess. It's not your job to fix it, right? But it is your job to protect your own citizens. And so I'm concerned when I think about Indian cities. I think a lot about so-called adaptation, making sure that we climate-proof these cities from flood, from heating, and so forth. I'm not sure I know what the right answers are, but I know that it needs to be a priority, and know that we need to be thinking through things that are going to make sure that fewer Indians die in the 21st century because of flood and heating.
I think you're one of the very few economists and people that I've heard say that we really need to be prioritizing adaptation in the context of India and some of these countries. Everyone is really looking at mitigation, and not at the per capita level, but at the country level or at an aggregate level where it still seems like a lot. So it's a very interesting take that you've brought on this. Now, speaking about what India is trying to do going forward, right? And some just advice your thinking over here. Now, India is looking to promote economic development and transform city regions into growth hubs. Cities are already engines of economic growth, but how do you promote them into regions of growth hubs? How do you make them contribute positively to the GDP and increase sort of quality of life for everyone? And if you were to advise decision makers who are trying to make this happen on the best way forward to achieve this transformation, what are the 3 or 4 things that you would prioritize to facilitate, thriving but equitable and resilient future for Indian cities? And may I add, both big and small, because India has mega cities, and you have cities with millions of population, tens of millions, and then you have really small cities with a population of 50,000 to 100,000. So, what would be your advice there?
My mantra for local economic development has always been attract and train smart people and then more or less get out of their way. Now, there are two public policy proposals that are embedded in that. The first of which is, and I cannot say this enough, education, 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 right? Continuing to invest in young Indian women, young Indian men, making sure that they have lots of skills to compete globally. That feels like a first order thing. This is both about the sort of high end education, the IITs, and also mid-level education, vocational training, lots of different areas like that. Secondly, it is amazing what India has achieved in terms of dismantling the low-license Raj, but there's still a great deal to be done. Right, there still is a great deal to be done in terms of making it easier to start a business, to grow a business, to build housing, to enable things. Okay, so those are the first two things. But to be clear, it's not like deregulation is the answer to reducing traffic congestion. It's not like deregulation is the answer to getting better water. Right, those require an active and capable state. And we need to think clearly about what we want to have happen with that. Again, I think local control is likely to be the right answer. I think in many cases, it can be done in a way that is relatively apolitical, because in fact, there is not a BJP or Congress way to clean a city street or to deal with a sewer, right? There's just one way to do it. That's a line that's associated with Fiorella LaGuardia that I tried to adapt, right? There's no Republican or Democratic way to clean up a city street. But in some sense, and I don't want to be sort of ideological about whether or not this requires a public-private partnership or a purely public provider. I believe that Deng Xiaoping was right when he said that it doesn't matter if a cat is white or black as long as it catches mice, right? We need to figure out what are the institutions that are going to make sure that Indian streets are better, that they're better paved, that they're safer. I mean, traffic congestion is a big deal. And I'm certainly open to things like congestion pricing, as London has had, as Singapore has had for 40 years. But the work of both Gabriel Kreindler and Gilles Duranton and his co-authors have shown us that nighttime speeds in Indian cities are also very slow. And so that suggests that, road quality, road paving is actually a big deal as well. And so, monomaniacal focus on the basics of urban life is my third recommendation, like on top of schooling, on top of deregulation, and figuring out the right institutions to make that happen.
Very interesting. So basically, attract, retain smart people, talent, deregulation, and then the schooling and the education part of it, and also figuring out the institutional instruments for delivery. Um, Super interesting. And do you have a take on, what should the smaller cities in India be doing versus the larger cities, and how can this differential urbanization still contribute to economic development?
I think it's great to have cities of different sizes. I think great, it's a wonderful thing as a country to be able to offer different ways of living. And people often ask me what's the right size or what's the largest size that cities can be. There's no right answer to that. Different people want to live in different things. And it's great to have competition among cities, just as it's great to have competition among companies. In terms of smaller cities, you have fewer of the urban dysfunctions, right? And so the quality of life is a big plus for that. You do, however, lose some of the connections that actually make cities thrive. I would say even more so. So for Mumbai, I probably would focus more on, how to make the city more livable, how to make mobility easier, and I might focus a little bit less on the education side. If I were on a mid-sized city, I'd focus more on the education side and maybe less on the livability,
Super
because it's
interesting.
already gotten the livability advantage and probably has fewer highly skilled people to start out with.
Yes. No, that's I think that's spot on. One super last question, Ed, is in 2008 you wrote Triumph of the City, and then in 2021 you wrote Survival of the City. So we went from triumph to survival, and what caused that?
Well, COVID's caused that. So Triumph was actually written, I think it was actually published in 2011, but you are right. I started writing it in 2008. It was many years. It reflected many more years of research. And in some sense, it was the child of my youth. So the dismal days of the 1970s in New York that were so formative for me were followed by a remarkable urban renaissance. And so it felt natural for me to be writing about Triumph. Survival was written in a heat over 6 months when I was locked down. And it was, with my dear friend and colleague, David Cutler. It was sort of our ability to sort of maintain some sanity and to work together and learn a little bit of Indian history, at least some of it. And that was very much about cities under siege from COVID, but it was also a reflection of the fact that the previous 6 or 7 years, that the incomplete triumph that cities had had in the West was becoming more problematic. The fact that, yes, our crime levels had fallen, but the way that we had reduced crime levels ended up with far too many young Americans either in jail or being, harassed by cops or something else. Similarly, like the problems of our housing markets were clear. The fact that cities were providing lots of economic opportunity for adults, but not for children. All of these incomplete triumphs were grating on America's cities. And I was particularly worried that in an era of COVID and Zoom, we would decide to handle those incomplete triumphs in a way that was deeply harmful for cities. Meaning that we would replay what happened in the 1970s when there were leaders like John Lindsay or like Jerome Kavanaugh in Detroit, who were focused on sort of righting historical wrongs, but they did so by trying to run a local safety net. They did so by taxing local rich people, by taxing businesses. And the problem with doing that at the local level is rich people can just leave. Businesses can just leave. And that's what happened in the 1970s. And I was worried that we're going to replay that in 2021 and 2022 and try to solve various problems by letting crime go crazy and taxing more, and rather than by being smart about it. And I think that's why I wrote it. And I am convinced that we can make our cities more humane, more functional, safer, without turning them into places that actually target the skilled, that target the rich. But we need to do so by getting smarter. And this is a long-term mantra of mine, which is I'm tired of long-standing debates in the US about more or less government. What we need is better government, right? And it's not an issue of shrinking, and it's not an issue of expanding. It's an issue of getting more for the dollars we spend. And I am convinced that America's city governments can do this, and I'm also convinced that India's city governments can do this.
Well, that sounds like the title of your next book, Incomplete Triumph. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ed. This was an enlightening conversation as always. Thank you so much for your time, for the brilliant work that you're doing and that we continue to follow. And I hope to be in touch again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dave.